Okay. Well, if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn into Genesis 46. We've been studying the life of Joseph, and we're coming towards the end. We have gone through Joseph's journey away from his family and positive privilege and into the depths of slavery and prison. And then he rose to being the second most powerful man in the world, really, as he's second only to Pharaoh in Egypt, which is the world empire at the time. The majority of the record of Joseph's life, as you can see under the house of Joseph, is the house of Joseph in the house of Pharaoh. It's at the end of his life. And we have been covering so far 5 subplots within that last major section. And it ran through chapters 42 through 45, ending with Joseph and his brothers being reunited, and an invitation being made to his father Jacob to come to Egypt. And last week we looked at the moving of Jacob's house from Canaan to Egypt, where we saw that God's provisions for the journey, first from the generosity of Pharaoh, then from Joseph's generosity. Then we saw the journey back of the brothers to get their father, to relay the message. And then in chapter 46, 1 through 7, we saw that Jacob was packing up and moving, and he had to get that confirmation from God in Beersheba. And then finally the text tells us that he made it all the way there to Egypt, and it stopped there. So the question that was implicit at the end of that was, he's down now into the land of Egypt, but do they have a place for him? Where's he going to go? This is a different nation. This is not his home. And now what do they do? So this week I've entitled the message, Receiving the House of Jacob. It's Genesis 46, 8 through 47, 12. And as you probably noticed, we're going to cover a lot of text today. So there's going to be a lot of reading. And in this text, we're going to look at 4 parts of Joseph receiving the house of Jacob. And the first part identifies the house of Jacob. And it records the genealogy of the house of Jacob. And the Hebrew text has a major break there. It has a marking that signifies a major break after the genealogy. So really this genealogy is part of the previous section of the journey down. So the whole house of Israel is down, and now it's telling you who that is. It's making a historical record of that, of who made that journey. So first part of verse A is the introduction to the genealogy. It says, now these are the names of the sons of Israel, Jacob and his sons, who went to Egypt. This is a traditional introduction for a genealogical record. The focus will be on the male descendants, and it functions as a historical record of, number 1, the families and future clans that will make up a nation. And so the original readers in Moses' day can see their roots and see where they came from and see their ancestors in this story, in God's miraculous plan that he's carrying out through Joseph. And then number 2, it shows that Israel's ancestry came from Canaan. And thus original readers can see, yes, we're not supposed to stay in Egypt, although it's more comfortable there, we really need to move back. That's the promised land. That's where God is returning us. And that's the land in which he's promised to our forefathers. So it shows God's sovereign plan for them who are reading it. So the genealogy itself is recorded in the second part of verse 8 all the way to verse 15. And it's arranged by the mothers, the 4 mothers of these children. And the first mother is Leah. So we see the sons of Leah in 8 through 15. So let me start there. It says, Reuben, Jacob's firstborn. Now the sons of Reuben were Hanok and Palu and Hezron and Carmi. The sons of Simeon were Jemuel and Jamin and Ohad and Jachin and Zohar and Shaul, the son of the Canaanite woman. So obviously this text communicates, and as we see as we go through the genealogy, that all of the sons of Israel had wives, because they all have children, they all have families. And this is kind of straightforward, except for the end there where it says Shaul was the son of a Canaanite woman. And why is that? Why did they even list that? Why is that important to the author? Notice that it's son, singular. It implies that this is a second wife. Possibly his first wife died, and this is a second wife. And it may imply also that typically the wives of the sons of Israel came from their extended relatives in Mesopotamia. But here he married a woman, a Canaanite woman. It's hard to know exactly why she's listed. It could also be, secondarily, it could mean that they were married, Simeon and this other Canaanite woman were married in Egypt, and she had a son and gave birth to Shaul. But that, yes, indeed, she came from Canaan as well. So being a part of this genealogy. So the ultimate answer is, why is it listed that Shaul is the son of a Canaanite woman? The scholarly answer is, I don't know. We only have to guess. Moving to verse 11, it says the sons of Levi are Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. The sons of Judah are Er and Onan, and Shelah, and Perez, and Zerah. But Er and Onan died in the land of Canaan. And the sons of Perez were Hezron and Hamul. Now, the record here, the extra information that are given about Er and Onan dying in the land of Canaan, and we read about that in Genesis 37. That's listed there. And notice the extra information about the sons of Perez. And Perez is Judah's son. So here, these are Judah's grandsons, Jacob's great-grandsons. And they were not alive when they moved down to Egypt because Perez was only a child. We follow the record from Genesis 37. Perez and Zerah came from Tamar. So these are children when they come down. But they are listed because they are very important for the nation of Israel as being clans. If you look in Numbers 26, there are two clans of Hezron and Hamuel. So it's very important families for the nation of Israel. Going on to verse 13, the sons of Issachar are Tola and Puvah and Job, which is another form of Job, and Shimron. The sons of Zebulun were Sered and Elon and Jalil. And these are the sons of Leah, whom she bore to Jacob in Padan Aram, with his daughter Dinah. All his sons and his daughters numbered 33. Now, the number 33, if you're adding them up, they either add up all the male descendants, or if you're leaving out the two sons that had died, it also would include Dinah and possibly a second daughter. If you notice, it says all the sons and daughters, plural. And like I said before, I think there are far more daughters that are just not listed here. And now, one thing as we move on, all of these names that are listed here, they have meanings. But many of the meanings of their names are debated or unknown. So I'm not going to go through what the Hebrew names actually mean. I found that there's very little information as far as to convey there. But moving on, these are the sons of Leah. Now we come to the sons of Zilpah. And Zilpah was Leah's handmaid. And verse 16 says the sons of Gad were Ziphion and Haggai and Shunai, Esbon and Eri and Aradai and Arali. The sons of Asher were Imnah and Ishva and Ishvi and Beriah and their sister, Sarah. Now the sons of Beriah were Heber and Malkiel. These are the sons of Zilpah, whom Laban gave to his daughter Leah. And she bore Jacob these 16 persons. Once again, it's pretty straightforward, and yet there's a daughter involved, listed there, a sister. Why is Zerah recorded? The answer again is, I don't know. We have no other information about her other than in the two other lists in the scriptures, she's listed as a daughter of Asher. So it's possible that she was known and there's other information about her that just hasn't been recorded in Scripture. But we know nothing else about her. One day in heaven, we'll know. But she is included here in the list of 16 people, in the total. So it is possible that she, when she got married, that her children, her descendants, became part of the number of the nation of Israel. That she was granted her own clan. So that's possible, but we really just don't know. And so notice also that Beriah is a son of Asher, and so his children, Heber and Malchiel, are grandchildren for Asher and great-grandchildren. So the question is did they go to Egypt? Now, it's possible. Beriah is probably Asher's oldest, and it is possible that both Asher married young, had children young, and Beriah married young and had children young, and so it's possible. But it's specifically listed because Heber and Malchiel are important clans. Numbers 26 lists them as clans. Next, we turn to the sons of Rachel, verses 19 through 22. It says, the sons of Jacob's wife Rachel were Joseph and Benjamin. Now to Joseph in the land of Egypt were born Manasseh and Ephraim, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore to him. And was right on, the sons of Benjamin are Bela and Becher, and Ashbel, and Gera, and Naaman, and Ehai, and Rosh, and Mumpim, and Humpim, and Ard. These are the sons of Rachel, who were born to Jacob. There were 14 persons in all. Now, if you notice, Benjamin has 10 sons listed here. And there's a big question from scholars, are these literally all his sons, or do they include grandchildren as well? It's very difficult to know. Very difficult, because number one, he's the youngest. Could he have enough time to bear 10 children? Well, at this time when they're going down, he's in his early 30s. So if he got married early, in his late teens, it's possible. And Hebrew has no word for grandson. It's only son. So if you read in the scriptures, Jacob is the son of Abraham, that's correct. Actually, there's Jacob, Isaac, Abraham, right? So Jacob is technically a grandson. But in Hebrew, there's no word for grandson. It's always son of. So that makes it difficult because you don't know if all of these names are actually literal sons or are they grandsons or great-grandsons. And the lists in Numbers 26 and 1 Chronicles chapter 7 and 1 Chronicles chapter 8 has fewer sons of Benjamin. And lists some of these names as being grandsons. Now, the difficulty there as well is that names in Hebrew families were often repeated. Just because it was one generation doesn't mean they won't name them in the very next generation or the generation after. So it is difficult to know if these are his literal children or grandchildren. But either way, they're making up important families and clans within the nation of Israel, and that's why they're recorded. Next, we see the sons of Bilhah. And this is Rachel's handmaiden in verses 23 through 25. You see the sons of Dan, which are Hushim. The sons of Naphtali are Jaziel, and Guni, and Jezer, and Shillem. Now, these are the sons of Bilhah, whom Laban gave to his daughter, Rachel. And she bore these to Jacob. And there were 7 persons in all. Now, I don't know if you noticed this, but if you look at the numbers, basically the handmaidens basically have half of the number of the descendants as the primary wives of Jacob. And then verses 26 and 27, we have the conclusion of the genealogy. And the text says, all the persons belonging to Jacob who came to Egypt, his direct descendants, not including the wives of Jacob's sons, were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph, who were born to him in Egypt, were 2. And all the persons of the house of Jacob who came to Egypt were 70. Okay, so now we need to take a closer look at those numbers. What we have is in the list themselves, we have from Leah, we have 33, but then 2 died. We have Dinah listed from Zilpah, 16, from Rachel, but we have 3, Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh are already down there, and then from Bilhah. That makes 71. So if you take away the 5, you're left with 66 persons who came down with Jacob. But then how do we go from 66 back up to 70? Well, it's probably when you add Jacob himself, Joseph, Manasseh, and Ephraim, then you have 70 persons who came down sooner or later to Egypt in total. Now, remember that this number, 70, doesn't include the wives, and probably not servants, and probably not all of Jacob's daughters or granddaughters. So the number is larger than 70. We're probably talking a little bit, probably even close to 100 people coming down, but it's still a relatively small number. And the reason, there's a literary reason why it's listed as 70 as being important. Because in an early portion of Genesis, in Genesis 10, there's a table of nations where the sons of Noah, Ham, Japheth, and Shem are listed. And there are 70 nations listed there that are spreading out throughout the whole world. So why 70 again? Here, what it's communicating implicitly is that this famine is a second major judgment. Although it's being much smaller in scale, it's a second judgment of God on the wickedness of man. And now he's bringing about a new people from this smaller number, 70 souls, that will be the descendants of a vast nation whose numbers will be more than the stars of heaven or the sand of the seashore. But before we move on, we need to talk about a historical problem. Because in the book of Acts, when Stephen is communicating, he says that Joseph sent word and invited Jacob, his father, and all his relatives to come to him, and 75 persons in all. Now, why in one place does it say 70, in one place it says 75? Well, the Greek translation of Genesis 46 adds 5 more names to Joseph's descendants. It mentions some of the children of Manasseh and Ephraim, so his grandchildren, and then also his great-grandchildren, 5 in number. And why is that? It's because they became important clans and families within the nation of Israel. So do you see the point here? This whole list is given of important families in which the reader can communicate with and connect with. Oh, that's me. That's where I came from. And they can see themselves in this story. And that is a very Jewish way of thinking. The author of Hebrews bears witness to this. In Hebrews 7:9, he's talking about Abraham when he gave tithes to Melchizedek. It says, and so to speak, through Abraham, even Levi. Remember, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Levi. That's a great-grandson. Levi, who received tithes normally in the Old Testament, in the Mosaic Law period, paid tithes. So Levi paid tithes, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. So do you see what the author of Hebrews is saying? That Levi was very much there in Abraham. And he's making this figure of speech saying that he actually paid tithes to Melchizedek. So in the same way, those grandchildren who are not yet born yet, or great-grandchildren, they were there in their fathers as they came down to Egypt. And that's why they're listed there. So these lists are important for identifying the nation of Israel through their ancestors, according to their major clans and families. And the next part of our text moves on from this. It moves on to a new section, which talks about Joseph receiving the house of Jacob. Now in the first section, verses 28 through 30, we see Joseph is reunited with his father. We've been waiting for this for a long time. 28 says, now he sent Judah before him to Joseph to point out the way before him to Goshen. And they came into the land of Goshen. So if you notice on the map, there's 2 major red lines. And remember, Jacob came from Beersheba, and from Beersheba there's 2 major highways, a northern route here or a southern route here. And this is the region of Goshen. So he's somewhere along, either around here or around here, just entering the land and waiting. And notice Jacob sends Judah out to go find Joseph, and Joseph would be in the capital, which is down here. And he's asking him, where do we go? What do we do? Now this is very fitting that he sends out Judah, because it was Judah who's the one who sold Joseph in the first place. So it was Judah who forced the departure. So now it's Judah who's making the arrangements for the reunion. So it's very fitting literarily. So the land of Goshen was a region where herds would normally be grazing. The herds within Egypt would be grazing. So if you have foreigners coming down with their herds, and about 100 people, and you're living in that land, well, you might not see that as you might not welcome them with open arms. There may be trouble there. So that's why he's sending Judah out to say, okay, where do we go? What land is ours? Where can we have peace and where can we have your protection? This is a predicament for them. So Judah was sent from Joseph to get those instructions exactly where to go and where would there be their new home. And verse 29 through 30 says, Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. And as soon as he appeared before him, he fell on his neck and wept on his neck a long time. Then Israel said to Joseph, now let me die, since I have seen your face, that you are still alive. The reunion, Joseph prepares his chariot right away. That's the speediest way to travel. He's going straight up. And when they meet, he falls on his neck and wept. This is the same response he had towards Benjamin in chapter 45, verses 14. And these are tears of joy because he's receiving that relationship for years he's longed for. That was stolen, taken from him. This was the way God has designed it for a father and a son to have that relationship. And he finally has it. And that emotion, that loss, the realization that is finally here, and it kind of emphasizes the many years without. It's a happy, joyful time. And this is experienced by Israel as well. And he says, now let me die, since I have seen your face and you're still alive. The last aspiration of his life has now been completed. Now, these words are connected with, and they complete what he said earlier in chapter 45, where it said, then Israel said, it is enough, my son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. Remember, that was his last thing he wanted to do, his priority in his life. So again here in these words of Israel, of Jacob, we are reminded of the value of life and the preciousness of God's design for relationships between fathers and sons, especially within the community of God's people. Throughout this whole story, the family here is being emphasized. Family unity and family relationships. This is within God's covenant people. Within God's covenant people, God's followers, his believers, should be an example of what family should be like. Now, when you have family that are non-believers, that is hard to happen. It's hard to do. We're to strive for it, but it's not going to be the same. It can't be the same. But we should make every effort to do, because that is God's design. That's what's best for us. That's what will bring peace and joy and glory to him here on earth. So Joseph's relationship continues as he gives his family, his father and his brothers, instructions. Verses 31 through 34. The text says, Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh, and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household, who were in the land of Canaan, have come to me. And the men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of livestock. And they have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have. And when Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? You shall say, your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth even until now, both we and our fathers, that you may live in the land of Goshen. For every shepherd is loathsome to the Egyptians. Now, this is kind of interesting instructions. Tell them that you are an occupation that's loathed. It doesn't really seem to fit much, but Joseph is a plan. And Joseph's plan, it implies that Pharaoh expects Joseph's whole family to live in the capital and to assimilate into Egyptian culture. So in Joseph's plan, its two-pronged plan is to secure the land of Goshen for his family. It's, number one, he will inform Pharaoh that his kin are shepherds who have brought all their livestock, all their flocks and their herds, meaning sheep and goats and cattle, intending to continue their occupation, that profession, which is the profession of their fathers, which is honorable to pass on that from generation to generation. And thus, by them bringing down their herds, they're not going to be a burden to Egypt. I mean, realize that Joseph is the second in command. They could come in and just live off the state, live in without working. They can have an early retirement. But that is not Joseph's plan, nor that's not what they do. They continue to work. And in fact, that's what God has designed us to do. There's no such thing as retirement in Scripture. Men is designed from before the fall to work. It's part of who God's designed for us, to have that accomplishment and to see God's creation, bringing about its fruits. And then number two, the place for herds in Egypt is in this region, in the region of Goshen. And that is separate from the major cities that are in the south, because shepherds are loathsome to the Egyptians. Now, we need to ask before we go on, why are they loathsome? Why is that a problem? Well, herdsmen, nomads from the north and from this region over here were known to cause the Egyptians problems. They are similar to what we might say they're gypsies. They don't have any homeland or cities. They come in, and you don't know whether they're trying to trick you or steal from you or rob you. There's a fear and a mistrust of nomads and of shepherds. They would be less hygienic than the Egyptian standards. That would include hair. Egyptians shaved because of lice, and so that's one thing, hygiene. They would undoubtedly, the shepherds and nomads of the north would come into the Egyptian cities and raid them on raiding parties and steal from them and then disappear. They would also have countless robbers and stealers of people that are traveling to and from Egypt. And so they would just cause a constant nuisance to the nation and the people there. And thus they became loathsome. And it's known from history that the Phoenician and Canaanite shepherds often took and enslaved Egyptians. So there's just great animosity, and you can understand why. So since they are detestable, being shepherds, although they're going to be given land, Israel will be separated. They will live and remain in a distinct area, distinct from Egyptian culture and influence. And that's part of Joseph's plan. Now, in addition, the text could be implying, and we know this from other texts in Scripture, that Joseph knew that he needed to separate them so that they could worship freely Yahweh. In Exodus chapter 8, verse 26, when Moses is talking to Pharaoh to let his people go, it says that Moses is saying, "It is not right to do so, for we will sacrifice to the Lord our God what is an abomination to the Egyptians. If we sacrifice what is an abomination to the Egyptians before their eyes, will they not then stone us?" Now, what is he talking about? He's saying that the sacrifices, remember, this is before the Mosaic Law. So this is the sacrifices that would be applicable to Joseph's day, to worship of God, that were passed down in the patriarchs. That their sacrifices are abomination to them, and so much so that they could be stoned for it. So if they're separate in the land of Goshen, they could still worship freely. Now, why would this be an abomination? The answer is I don't know, but in speculation, the law of God has them sacrifice cattle and sheep sometimes, but in cattle in Egypt represents the goddess Hathor, and this is one of the representations of her. Now, it is possible that that would be seen as sacrilegious if the Israelis did that in a different context other than maybe a temple or the special rites of the worship of Hathor, which is a goddess of women, love, beauty, pleasure, and music. And that particular goddess was viewed as being vengeful and one of punishes people. So you can see the need to be distinct, possibly, because that god, Hathor, was well before Joseph's time. So that is already in existence in Egypt while Israel's coming down. So in any case, Joseph initially receives them and is planning for them to live distinctly. Now the third part is Joseph presents the house of Jacob before Pharaoh. And this occurs in two phases. The first phase, we see Joseph presents 5 brothers before Pharaoh, verses 1 through 6. It says, "Then Joseph went in and told Pharaoh and said, 'My father and my brothers and their flocks and their herds and all that they have come out of the land of Canaan, and behold, they are in the land of Goshen.' Now he took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to his brothers, 'What is your occupation?' So they said to Pharaoh, 'Your servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers.' And they said to Pharaoh, 'We have come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore, please let your servants live in the land of Goshen.' Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is at your disposal. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land, and let them live in the land of Goshen. And if you know any capable men among them, then put them in charge of my livestock. So this scene confirms everything that Joseph, in his wisdom, had anticipated. He planned it all out, and here he's carrying it out perfectly. Notice that the brothers address Pharaoh in a very respectful, humble way, as your servants. And notice in verse 4, they, the brothers, the five here, spoke to Pharaoh. But then in verse 5, it says, then Pharaoh said to Joseph. Now probably the brothers are speaking Hebrew and speaking through an interpreter to Pharaoh. And it could be that Pharaoh answers Joseph, who speaks both languages, or he's speaking to him after the brothers had left. And he deliberated and thought about what he was going to do. Either way, this is an official way of speaking, showing that Pharaoh is communicating his will through his number two, a man, through the steward of the house of Egypt. And notice here that Pharaoh gives them a greater honor by saying and offering them, saying to Joseph, if you know any capable men, if your brothers are capable, they're any good, they could be part of my, the royal herdsmen, keeping the livestock for Pharaoh. And that would be a huge honor, and that would give them protection. Because although they're Canaanites, they are herding and raising the kings, the pharaohs, so anyone else in Egypt wouldn't touch them. So it gives them greater privilege and protection. And it's known through Egyptian texts that this happens often. In an Egyptian text that talks about Ramses III, which is actually 500 years later, so it's a little bit away from this time, but that particular text says that Ramses III has 3,264 men that are mostly foreigners that take care of his herds. So this is a typical thing, this is a normal thing, and there could be possibly hundreds of people, if not thousands, there at this time, at this early point. Okay, so what's the point here? The point here is that the Lord was with Joseph in wisdom that resulted in the sons of Israel dwelling safely with plenty to eat in the land of Goshen, while there was a severe famine in the land of Canaan. That was the first phase. Now, the second phase of Joseph's presentation before Pharaoh is his presentation of his father before Pharaoh. Verses 7 through 10, which says, then Joseph brought his father Jacob and presented him to Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said to Jacob, how many years have you lived? So Jacob said to Pharaoh, the years of my sojourning are 130. Few and unpleasant have been the years of my life, nor have they attended the years that my fathers lived during the years of their sojourning. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out of his presence. So at a later date, probably when they were settled, Joseph makes arrangements to present his father to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh asked, how old are you? Now, it's probably because Jacob looks old to Pharaoh. And he is old. He's 130. And it's probably that Pharaoh, when he sees something that old, in that culture, someone that's old is due honor and respect. And there's a bunch of wisdom that's associated with age. So Pharaoh, notice, Jacob doesn't say, your servant. They're very much in a almost equal playing field here in speaking. And it's amazing language there for this culture and for this time. But Pharaoh respects him and is asking how old. And it's probable that Jacob is looking older, far older than his actually age. Because a lot of times when you live with great sorrow and great pain, that ages you. And that's what he says here, that he has had great sorrow. Now also in the ancient culture, when you're that old, when you reach that age, it's commonly thought of that you have received great blessing, divine favor. And so that's why also Jacob says, yes, I have this age, but my years are actually few, and they're unpleasant. They've been rough, they've been difficult. So if you think about his life, he was cheated out of working 7 years by Laban, and he had to work another 7 hard years in Mesopotamia. His daughter was violated, Dinah. He suffered the loss of his beloved wife, Rachel, and then he lived with years with the supposed death of Joseph. His life was one after another a great tragedy. I'm sure there was times of joy there, but there was also great sorrow. And he says that my years have been few and unpleasant, and they have not attained to the years of my fathers. Now, Abraham lived to be 175, and Isaac lived to be 180. And we know from the text that we're going to read next week that Jacob's going to live another 17 more years before he dies. But did you notice that Jacob blesses Pharaoh, both at the beginning and at the end? And obviously their conversation, their meeting was much longer than this. But the author is just giving us, which is Moses, giving us the important details, what he wants to communicate. And how is this possible? What is he doing here? What is this blessing? It's emphasized at the beginning and the end. Well, here, that blessing, the word blessing can mean a lot of different things, but here in this context, it's referring to a formal prayer of blessing that's asking God to reward Pharaoh for his kindness. Now, this will be allowed, the lesser blessing the greater would be allowed due to Jacob's age and probably his relationship with Joseph. And it is very much parallel to Paul's teaching in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 through 2. It says, "First of all, then, I urge that entreaties and prayers, petitions and thanksgivings be made on behalf of all men, for kings and all who are in authority, so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity." Just like the principle that Paul clearly delineates in 1 Timothy, Jacob and his whole household, it's starting a new life in Egypt. And he's under the authority of the Egyptian Pharaoh, who so far has really blessed him and has been showing great kindness to him. But either way, he's asking God to bless them upon the ruler of that land. And we see this as well when the Israelites are exiled into Babylon and in Persia, where Jeremiah and other prophets tell them to pray for the leaders so that it'll go well with you. Because if it goes well with them, it will go well with you. Same thing here. He's praying for them, that God would bless them so that they can live in peace. Now, this brings us to a final portion where Joseph settles the house of Jacob in Goshen. Verses 11 and 12. It says, "So Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had ordered. And Joseph provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food, according to their little ones." Now notice it says, it gave them a possession. That means they owned land. They were given their own land there in Egypt, which is huge. And notice that Joseph provided for his father, for his brothers, and the father's household. That means everyone else, the servants, the women, and according to their little ones. Now, what that's telling us is that the brothers were allotted different amounts of food, different amounts of grain, depending on the size of their family. It shows that every single person was provided for. It shows a great blessing of God, in favor of God, on Joseph and on the whole house of Jacob. Okay, so in these two concluding verses, there's two very, very important things that are communicated. Number one, Joseph fulfilled his promises to his father and to the whole family that he made when he invited them down in chapter 45, where he said, "You shall live in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children's children, and your flocks and your herds, and all that you have. There I will also provide for you, for there are still 5 years of famine to come, and you and your household and all that you have will be, and all that you have would be impoverished if they didn't come down." So here, our text, by repeating this, is emphasizing that Joseph is fulfilling his promises to provide for his family, to act kindly, to help them in their time of need. It shows us again that family relationship, especially among the people of God, to help and provide. That's important, number one. Joseph is fulfilling his promises. And that is not just a meaningless or emotionless promise, but it's out of love for his father and his family. But number two, It fulfills Joseph's second dream, the dream that the 11 stars and the sun and the moon will bow to him. So his brother is there, his mother, who is now Leah, and his father are under his provision, under his protection, and under his rule. He is the second in command of all of Egypt. He's ruling over them. And therefore, that prophecy, that dream is now fulfilled. And so now we come to the conclusion of our passage from today. So I want to go over again and reiterate the applications and main points. Number one, the naming of the descendants establishes these foundational families in a historical record from which God's promises to Abraham to make his descendants a great nation will be realized. It also shows why God will call them out of Egypt to go back to the promised land of Canaan. The genealogy reminds us that God's promises and his plans are sometimes multi-generational and much larger than we can imagine. He is a magnificent God, and his ways and his plans are far above ours. Number two, the emotional reunion between Joseph and his father. We are reminded of the value of life and the preciousness in God's design of the relationship between a father and son. That is what we were created to do. The family was created to have. Number three, in wisdom, Joseph has planned to protect, provide for, and keep his family distinct from the Egyptian culture by maintaining their occupation of shepherding in the land of Goshen. This was a fulfillment of the promises he made out of love for his father and his brothers. We must be people who pursue good for our families in their time of need, and as God has granted us the resources. And we must also be people who keep our promises. And then number four, Jacob honored Pharaoh by praying, asking for God's blessing over his life. We as well should be praying for God on behalf of our leaders, praying for their salvation, for their wisdom, for their justice, and for peace, and for anything else that God brings up to your mind.